Section 5 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 2 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 10a, North Africa and the Great Powers. From the dark jungles of equatorial Africa, from the monotonous veldt of the south, the scene shifts to the smiling and temperate coastlands of the north. The most valuable parts of the dark continent for commerce, investment, and white colonization are the northern and southern extremities, and while Britain was appropriating the latter, France was endeavouring to make of the former a new and greater France. Nowhere was the game of imperialist world politics played with greater abandon or more vicious international consequences than in the African lands north of the Tropic of Cancer. Here France and England grimly played for Egyptian stakes. Here Italy found reason to join, then later to desert the Triple Alliance. Here Germany and France desperately bid against each other for Morocco, until Europe was brought within a hair's breadth of war. Subsection: Avenging an Insult, Algeria. White sails swelling full against the blue water and bluer sky, a gallant French fleet coursed from Toulon through the Mediterranean, 500 miles to the African shore, where among the green palms gleamed the white mosques of Algiers. The Arab king, or Dey, of Algiers, so history relates, had recklessly struck a French envoy in the face with a fly-whisk, or fan, and to clear the escutcheon of France there was but one conventional method. To be sure, 3 years had intervened since the Dey's indiscretion, and France during these years had diplomatically considered various projects of international intervention, but the lapse of years does not clear away an indignity to national honour. The French fleet, therefore, sailed in May 1830 to punish Algiers. Furthermore, the French government announced its purpose to stop the attacks of piratical Algerian corsairs, then called Barbary pirates, on European shipping in the Mediterranean. Still more important, though not publicly proclaimed, was the desire of Charles X and his ministers to achieve some brilliant feat of arms and diplomacy which would not only restore the lustre of French prestige, dimmed since Waterloo, but also revive the declining popularity of the tottering Bourbon monarchy. In vain, British statesmen, fearful of anything which might destroy the quasi-sacred status quo, or still more sacrosanct balance of power, argued and threatened, and demanded a promise that the punitive expedition would withdraw from Algiers as soon as a brief lesson in good behaviour had been administered to the Dey. The bulldog's bark was worse than his bite, in this case. With impunity the French expedition occupied Algiers and the neighbouring coast district, and prepared to stay. The Dey was shipped to Naples. Though the exploit failed of its principal purpose, namely saving the throne of Charles X, it established France permanently in Algiers. To extend their power from the seaport of Algiers until it embraced the whole country of Algeria, larger than France itself, the French had to expend thousands of lives and millions of treasure during 3 decades of almost incessant fighting after 1830. Little did they realise, at the outset, to how costly an enterprise the caprice of Charles X's cabinet had committed them. Particularly serious was the protracted warfare required to subdue Abd el-Qaeda, a valiant Arab emir, who again and again raised the Mohammedan tribes to wage a holy war against the Christian invader. Not until 1847 was the emir taken prisoner and sent to France, and not until 1871 was the last important rebellion in Algeria crushed. Conquered more or less by chance, before the age of deliberate imperialism had dawned, Algeria aroused relatively little enthusiasm in France until the latter part of the 19th century. Then French imperialists found in Algeria not only a reason for new North African conquests, but a colony valuable in itself, Much larger than the mother country, Algeria was almost ideally suited for French colonization. Along its fertile coast plains, the olive tree grew in abundance. On the mountains back of the coast were rich forests, and between the mountain ranges lay plains and valleys, fertile of soil and healthful of climate, where cattle and grain could be raised. The native population was small. Even today there are but 5 million natives, and a generation or two ago there were less than 4 million. Unlike the Negroes of the equatorial jungles, the Algerians are industrious, accustomed to agriculture, handicrafts, and trade. Some of the Arabs who form the largest element in the population were tent dwellers and herdsmen wandering through the deserts and steppes of the back country. But in the more fertile regions, the Arabs had settled down before French conquest to live in villages of stone and to gain their livelihood by trade, tillage, or artistic handiwork. Racially different but culturally more influenced by the Arabs were the Berbers, white but suntanned. Along the coast, where they lived in stone houses with red-tiled roofs and tilled their fields with wooden ploughs, the Berbers are known as Kabiles. In the mountains they are the Shawias. In the desert they are the Tuareg tribes. In addition there are the Moors, of mixed Berber, Arab and European blood, indolent but canny tradesmen of the towns, well able to compete with the traditional mercantile ability of the numerous Jews. Though in Algeria there was room for colonists, Frenchmen are notoriously loath to quit La Belle Patrie, and after many decades of official attempts to attract French settlers, Algeria today has but 500,000 French inhabitants. Of these, no inconsiderable number are descended from the immigrants who forsook Alsace when that province was conquered by the Germans. Footnote: from 1871 to 1895, some 13,300 French families, 54,000 persons, were colonized on some 640,000 hectares of land in Algeria. End of footnote. French and other Europeans own the very fertile grain fields and vineyards and olive groves in the coast zone, and conduct the foreign trade and finance of the colony, leaving the natives to till the less fertile and more remote parts of the country, and to raise sheep and cattle for export. As General Marchand observed, of all the French colonies, Algeria is now by far the most important from the viewpoint of economic imperialism. As a market for French goods, it is 3 times as valuable as any other French possession. Indeed, among all the customers of French industry, Algeria ranks 7th, after Great Britain, Belgium, Germany, United States, Switzerland, and Italy. It is not, however, very important as a source of raw materials. With the notable exception of phosphate, its chief exports to France are wine, grain, and meat. Subsection: Coup de fortune ou de bourse, Tunis. From Algeria, French imperialists naturally turned their eye toward the neighbouring land of Tunis, just to the east, much like Algeria in climate and race, but smaller. In ancient times, Tunis was the seat of the mighty Carthaginian Empire, and later a prosperous Roman province of whose high civilization mute testimony is offered today by marble ruins of Roman temples and amphitheatres half submerged in the sands of the desert. These remains, by the way, seem to indicate that the regions in the south and interior of Tunis, now parched by winds from the Sahara, were once fertile and populous. But when Tunis began in the second half of the 19th century to attract the attention of European imperialists, it was a backward country, thinly populated and ruled by a Mohammedan bey, nominally subject to Turkish sovereignty, but actually swayed only by his own despotic caprice. In the 1860s, European speculators, moneylenders, traders and concession hunters began to swarm into Tunis. The Bey found it easy to borrow money, difficult to repay it. When his debts reached what for him was the stupendous figure of 28 million francs, at an average of 13% interest, he welcomed an apparently brilliant proposal that these miscellaneous obligations be repaid by floating a consolidated loan of 35 million francs on the Paris bourse at a more reasonable rate of interest. To his chagrin, he received less than 6 millions cash from the sale of his bonds, and found himself saddled with the interest charges on the new 35 plus the original 28 millions. When he levied higher taxes to carry the interest charges, his subjects rebelled. The cost of suppressing insurrection necessitated new loans. The additional interest burden meant higher taxes, and so the vicious circle went on: loans, taxes, rebellions, loans. It is said that in desperation the Bey, at length, took to poisoning rich subjects and confiscating their property. His French creditors, growing anxious as they received no payments on their coupons, insisted on the establishment of a financial commission to supervise, or curtail, his free-handed expenditures. Italian financiers and Italian patriots, remembering that Carthage was once subject to Rome, protested, with the result that Italy and England were admitted to the Commission in 1869, and the Tunisian debt was consolidated at 125 millions. Footnote: the nominal amount before consolidation was 160 millions. End of footnote. Then ensued years of financial rivalry. French, English, and Italian consuls at Tunis vying with each other in efforts to obtain influence at court and railway, telegraph, or land concessions for their fellow countrymen. It became increasingly apparent that, what with the disorderly condition of the country and the insecurity of its debt, and what with the awakening of European imperialism, one of the three powers would soon appropriate Tunis. Though at the Bey's court the Italians enjoyed most favour, France was more fortunate in European chancelleries. The Disraeli Salisbury government of England was glad at the Berlin Congress of 1878 to inform the French diplomatist Waddington that England recognised the right of France, since she had occupied Algeria, to exercise decisive pressure on Tunis, and looked upon this result as inevitable. More plainly, Salisbury told Waddington France could take Tunis if she would offer no objection to the ambitions of Disraeli in Cyprus and the Near East. Bismarck likewise dropped a hint that Germany would not object to French intervention in Tunis. His motive, doubtless, was to involve France in colonial ventures, and to sow seeds of discord between France and Italy. And France advised Italy that
Italy cannot cherish dreams of conquest in Tunis without clashing against the will of France and risking a conflict with her.
Not long afterward, an English company offered to sell the railway property it possessed in Tunis. This apparently innocent business affair was viewed in Paris and Rome as a crucial event, for though the value of the railway was paltry, perhaps 1 million francs, imperialists are quick to interpret the acquisition of any concession by foreign rivals as a national defeat and humiliation. French interests offered 1 million francs. An Italian concern, the Rubattino Co., which had acquired the first Italian foothold in Eritrea, on the Red Sea, offered 2.5. Finally, the Italians bought the property for 4,125,000 francs, 4 times the original French bid. It is significant that the Italian company made its extravagant offer only after receiving a promise of 600,000 lire a year from the Italian government. France, however, was not to be so easily balked. The sale of the railway occurred in July 1880. In August, by one of the coincidences that abound in imperialist annals, Paris received most ominous reports of warlike unrest among the Tunisian tribes on the border of Algeria. Such reports accumulated rapidly until in the spring of 1881 border raids provided the incident which is usually considered necessary to bring such matters to a head. Footnote: in the meantime, the French had warned Italy that the French cabinet could not look with indifferent eye, while Italian interests secured the control of the cables and railways of Tunis, and the French consul Roustan had persuaded or browbeaten the Bey to give the French Bon-Gelma Company railway concessions to compensate for the one the Italians had purchased. That the border raids were not the reason for French aggression in Tunis but merely provided a reason or pretext for armed action, appears pretty clearly from any detailed narrative. End of footnote. In April, Jules Ferry obtained from the Chamber of Deputies authority and 6 million francs to send a punitive expedition for the purpose of guaranteeing, in a serious and lasting fashion, the security and the future of African France, Algeria. Conquest, he explained, was far from his mind. 35,000 French soldiers were then thrown across the Algerian border into Tunis, but instead of merely punishing the unruly border tribes, the French army compelled the Bey to sign the Treaty of Bardo, May 12, 1881, allowing the French to occupy any regions it considered necessary, promising not to act in international affairs without first consulting France, accepting a generous French promise to protect his person, dynasty, and territories against attack, and last but not least, authorizing France to make new financial arrangements in the interest of his creditors. French troops then overran the country, and, by the end of the month, in the words of a French historian, pacification was complete. The conquest was complete. Ferry, however, was furiously assailed in French Parliament for what his opponent, Clemenceau, styled a coup de bourse, a stroke of high finance. To such taunts Ferry retorted it was a coup de fortune. Could any bon français, he asked the Chamber, November 5th, 1881, bear the thought of letting some other power, Italy, have
a territory which is, in every sense, the key to our house?
Furthermore, he asserted, there had been in the last decade no fewer than 2,365 violations of the Algerian frontier by Tunisian warriors. Surely these were numerous enough to justify intervention. But particularly meaningful, in the light of the events we have described, was Ferry's guarded statement that the immediate cause of intervention was the hostility shown by the Bey toward
French influence.
In the more candid words of the French Foreign Minister, Barthélemy Saint-Hilaire, the Bey had become hostile to
all French enterprises in Tunis.
He had, it is true, favoured Italian as opposed to French concessions for telegraphs, railways, and ports, and the Italians were gaining the upper hand. Not border raids, but economic rivalry and strategic interests brought French troops into Tunis. Though Ferry and his foreign minister were forced out of office by the criticism of the Tunis venture, and though Monsieur Roustan, the French consul, who had been so active in Tunisian concession hunting, was openly charged in the press with having been implicated in not altogether honourable financial schemes in Tunis, France nevertheless retained the fruits of Ferry's coup de bourse. 2 years later, on June 8, 1883, the new Bey of Tunis was presented with a treaty which he could hardly do otherwise than sign, and which openly established the French protectorat, and provided for a loan of 125 million francs and the enactment of reforms desired by France. Ferry, having returned to power, explained the advantages of a protectorate over annexation pure and simple. The protectorate was cheaper since there would be fewer French officials to pay. It was easier since the native administration would be responsible for details and petty difficulties, and it safeguarded the dignity of the vanquished. The protectorate meant that the native Bey was retained, and his successors have been, as nominal ruler with a staff of officials. But a French resident general representing the French Minister of Foreign Affairs presided over the Tunisian cabinet, conducted foreign relations, and had veto power over the Bey's edicts, and controlled the administration, while the French civil controllers or governors supervised the cades and chiefs. At present, 8 of the 11 ministers of the Bey are Frenchmen. Under French control, Tunis was unquestionably more orderly and more prosperous than of old. A French army supported by native regiments preserved peace, schools and colleges were opened, roads and railroads were built, a postal system established, commerce figures rising from 27 million francs in 1881 to 100 in 1899, and 1,395 in 1921, afford an index of remarkable economic progress. After 1885, the mining of phosphate of lime for fertilizer became a big industry. The French government, of course, took care to safeguard French financial interests by suppressing the International Financial Commission, consolidating the Tunisian debt at 4% interest, a profitable return since the bonds had been purchased at much less than par. France could not at once exclude foreign commercial interests from Tunis, as Great Britain had obtained from the Bey in 1875 a treaty promise to limit the tariff to 8% ad valorem on imports, and other powers had treaties providing for equal treatment. But in 1896 to 1897, these powers gave up their rights and permitted France to establish a high protective tariff in Tunis, from which French goods were in large part exempted. It is interesting to note that Great Britain consented to this step only on the explicit condition that British cotton goods should not be taxed more than 5% ad valorem, and as a result, Great Britain continued to supply the Tunisian Arabs with most of their flowing cotton garments, while France practically monopolised the other branches of trade after 1898. Tunis, like Algeria, is temperate and suitable for white colonisation, but despite the earnest efforts of a Committee of French Settlement to promote French immigration, Tunis has attracted only 55,000 French settlers and businessmen. The French, by the way, occupy 2,530,000 acres as compared with the total 7 million acres of tillage land available for the population of 2 millions. Strangely enough, there are almost 50% more Italians than Frenchmen in Tunis. By the punitive expedition of 1881, then, France gained a fairly valuable colony. But she gained also an enemy. Tunis, remember, is the Carthage of ancient history, and as such was regarded by Italian patriots as the historic footstool of Rome. Great was the Italian indignation when France occupied the country of Hannibal. And in the very next year, Italy joined hands in the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The secret negotiations between Rome, Berlin, and Vienna, published since the Great War, reveal the depth of Italian enmity toward France during the 2 decades that followed 1881. When the Triple Alliance was renewed in 1887, Italy signed with Germany a secret treaty, Article 3 of which provided, "If it were to happen that France should make a move to extend her occupation, or even her protectorate, or her sovereignty, under any form whatsoever, in the North African territories, whether of the Vilayet of Tripoli or of the Moroccan Empire, and that in consequence thereof Italy, in order to safeguard her position in the Mediterranean, should feel that she must herself undertake action in the same North African territories, or even have recourse to extreme measures in French territory in Europe, the state of war which would thereby ensue between Italy and France would constitute ipso facto the casus foederis." In short, Germany and Italy together would fight to prevent any further extension of French imperialism in northern Africa. The reference to extreme measures in French territory in Europe was interpreted by Prince Bismarck to mean Nice and Corsica. End of section 5.